Once again, welcome to take two of this episode of Pioneering Perspectives Friday Features. And this show's topic is sexual integration beyond morality. And we have our guest here today, Lorina. Welcome again.
Thank you.
Hey. Yeah. So I was just saying in the previous take, this is take two because we had technical difficulties, that I first discovered you in a post when the whole Me Too thing was happening on social media, and you made a post about the effects of infant male circumcision on violence in adult men. And it was a very unusual perspective, and I think you were the only woman that was talking about it at that time that I knew of. And really the second person, the other person was a friend of mine named Michael Paul, who had started having flashbacks of his circumcision when, as an adult man, and he felt this rage and he had to really process it. And he made a whole series of posts about it for about at least a year.
Oh, wow.
About his own healing journey. Yeah. So yeah, that
went over.
Yeah, that was crazy amazing to watch.
I imagine. I did one post on it, and then I was reeling for like a month or two around trying to integrate and process the amount of charge that got touched in the post. I noticed myself a little gun shy, honestly, after speaking to that experience of my process of turning my attention towards the reality of circumcision and feeling more deeply into the impact and the hidden impact of it on our culture and our consciousness collectively, not just men, but how it impacts male-female dynamics, how it could impact the tone of trust and attention to boundaries and self-awareness in our intimate relationships, sexual intimate relationships. And it was really, the internet doesn't feel like an entirely safe place to process rage. So there was a bit of backlash that was challenging as somebody who understands herself to be really energetically sensitive. And so it took some time for kind of the waves of intensity to settle down in my system. And so just you bringing it up in this moment, I notice a little hesitancy and a trepidation into that topic. And it's an important topic. I know there's going to be a screening sometime in April locally on a movie called American Circumcision that I'm grateful is out there to bring more awareness to that reality.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know until he started posting about it, and he started sending links to like pictures of how it actually works, and I was really shocked at how horrible it is. I had no idea that that's how it's done. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the most shocking pieces of information for me on that topic was the fact that the majority of circumcisions don't even use anesthesia. Like, it's very minimal. And to me, when I was thinking about sexual integrity and this topic that we're moving towards in this I think where the medicine lies and the wound lies is in this split between mind and body and bringing more integrative relationship how our consciousness relates to our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And to be in a culture that where we can feel so disassociated and be so disconnected from the reality of the impact of having tens of thousands of nerve endings of our most sensitive and precious parts of our anatomy to be cut off routinely and not be aware on a felt sense level of that impact is just like indicative of how much of there's a disconnect in our culture between mind and body, how much there's a
Yeah.
of sensation, of pleasure, of the wisdom of our animal instincts. Like, if we lived in a culture where there's a consistent nurturing of the relationship between our minds, our consciousness, our capacity to be self-aware, and our capacity to set intentions and regulate our experience with our sensations and our emotions and our body impulses, then circumcision and the consistent thinking that happens in our culture around sexual boundary crossing, I don't think would be as viral, as insidious as it is in our culture. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing around the circumcision.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been just kind of loading. I haven't really given
Yeah,
you
it makes sense. And
reflect.
also there it almost feels to me like you're also speaking to the lack of empathy on the people doing the circumcision, like the doctors themselves, but also even the parents letting it happen. And although in some cases the parents don't even know how it's done,
No,
you
it's
know,
kind of
they're yeah,
taken away from
yeah,
the guys.
hmm yeah, and so it's really the people actually doing it that if they were more connected to their own bodies, they would feel on some level that baby's pain as well.
Right.
Uh, yeah, and I bring this up because last week I was having a conversation with a woman, and she was talking about one her family like hitting when she was younger, hitting the servant girl back in the East, and I had a flashback when she said that, and of this little girl being hit by this older woman, and she was like, I don't know what she did wrong, but whatever it was, she doesn't really deserve like being slapped all, like that. And but in my naivety as a little boy, I thought, this older woman with authority was right. And she started crying, and the louder she cried, she would hit her harder, and she would accuse the little girl of defaming her by making all the neighbors, hear her cry and, making her look bad, which was a form of gaslighting, which I didn't recognize at that time. And and I found myself later that night actually crying myself.
Mm.
Uh, and at first I even felt guilty for crying because like, wait a minute, I'm not even the one that was hit. But I was really stepping into her shoes and feeling her pain. I was like, oh my God, that was so wrong. And that's just being slapped. Like, so imagine your most sensitive thing being cut off. Can't even imagine that. Like,
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to even
yeah.
touch the edges of it because it is such intense,
hmm
um,
Yeah.
such an intense experience of pain and violation and
hmm
trust
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
a personal level, and we're not even conscious of it because it happens so young. And one of the pieces
hmm
I wrote about in that post was something called implicit memory, which is the only type
mm
of memory that gets laid down in the first 18 months of our lives because it requires a hippocampus to be able to
mm
process information. And it's the only type of, and it's a type of memory that gets laid down during trauma. So it's kind of double header in the case of circumcision. But in the case of implicit memory, it has a unique feature of not feeling like a memory. Versus explicit memory, when you think about what did I do yesterday, it feels like something that happened. Versus implicit memory, you feel like it's happening right now. The most obvious case is veterans in having a flashback.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a little more subtle in our daily lives when it comes to trauma and these core young imprints around. Yeah, there's like the ideas around projection or not really seeing what's happening here now is often distorted by these really charged implicit memories. So part of the work, in my opinion, around creating more sexual integrity, more sexual integration is using our hippocampuses, which are activated through focused attention, intentional focused attention to the subtle things that are a part of the matrix of an implicit memory, which includes sensations, perceptions, core beliefs, things we want to do with our bodies, ways we start organizing ourselves in anticipation of things. So the more mindfulness we can bring to those experiences, the more focused attention we could bring to those experiences, we can begin to start to differentiate between what was happening in the past and what is happening in now. And so much of the our defenses and our wounding of each other come from this illusion that what the wounds that happened to us in the past are happening now, and so we're defending ourselves and we're attacking others and we're trying to protect these vulnerable parts of ourselves in this kind of like really subtle flashback, if you will, like subtle replay of these implicit memories. But the more mindfulness we can bring to these embodied experiences and our core beliefs, then we can start to get more and more in the present time and thus have more intimate, fulfilling, alive connections. That's my spiel.
Yeah.
How that's landing with you.
And that's great. Yeah. Let's see, there's no comments yet. Yeah, if anyone's watching, feel free to drop some hearts and likes and shares and comment about what we've said so far. So let's jump right into sexual integration. What is that exactly, and how is it beyond morality?
I don't want to dive into, let's see what I want to speak to first. Since we were talking about circumcision, I want to talk about some challenges of morality. It's like circumcision in a certain way, its origins are religious, right? Are from certain traditions and certain belief systems that result in this choice.
Yeah, like sex is dirty, masturbation is dirty, all of that stuff, right?
So there's a devaluing of pleasure and a devaluing of the body's natural being, state of being, in a lot of religious origins, morality. And so I find in my practice as a sex and intimacy coach that there's a lot of fear. Like I experience a lot of men who have fear in bringing their sexuality to women because there's a program that they've inherited in their childhood. upbringing around sex is bad. And then so, like, sexual impulses that are part of the nature of a human being gets pushed down and repressed, or can kind of result in a little hidden, in our sexuality being hidden and cloistered, and thus feeling not connected with others and ourselves. Or it can kind of leak out and do weird things, right? And, it's kind of it goes a little feral, if you will. The painful stories in the Me Too movement are examples of what happens when our sexuality is gets pushed away from a loving embrace that's possible in our awareness. And so when we've got so many moral ideas of what's good and wrong, then it has a way of kind of dividing us within ourselves. And so we're in conflict with our very nature. And when we're in conflict with our very nature, we move towards shame and disassociation. And shame and disassociation leads to behaviors that are harmful to self, that are dishonoring truth, and dishonoring. And so I find kind of right, wrong orientation not super helpful. Not feeling or integrating or of the true intimacy of everybody.
Yeah.
And so I'm a fan of integrity, not as a moral idea, but integrity as a manifestation. Integration, inspired by Dan Siegel's orientation to integration, where he defines it as differentiated parts of the map. And he uses the example of people singing choir or in harmony as an example of what an integrated system is like. So blocks to integration blocks to action or blocks to differentiation. So in choir, a block to differentiation would be everybody singing the same thing over and over again, everybody doing the same thing. That's kind of like rigid morality, like differences. Blocks to connection would be people putting their ears, like hands on their ears, and not listening to each other. Random thing. And then so that sounds like cacophony. And that sounds like kind of like not noticing each other and spilling and like hitting at each other, or kind of there's a certain amount of dysregulation in that situation. Integration between mind and body has that quality of what I was talking about earlier, of somatic mindfulness, of like my mind, which is my capacity to pay attention or monitor and regulate energy and information flow. connected and yet different from my body impulse, sensation, and emotions. There's a way that we direct our minds towards our embodied experience that's created. And so locks to connection would be me not paying attention, my mind not at all paying attention to what's happening. My mind not paying attention to my heart. A man's mind not paying attention to his vulnerability or sensitivity because he's been enculturated not paying attention to his emotions. Or a woman's mind not paying attention to her sexual desires and because she's been enculturated not pay attention. Those things are shameful. So she's not going to pay attention to those things. So there's a disconnect between our minds. Or there's an over connection where I feel this impulse and I'm not witness to, I lose kind of a certain level of witness consciousness in how my mind is holding my embodied experience, and then I'm flooded with emotion. And so I'm just like a ball of reactivity, and I'm accusing people, or I'm like feeling threatened. There's actually no real threat in the situation. So there's this way that the mind can get overly fused with the body and its sensations and its emotions and its body impulses. So, or we're just like, oh yeah, I feel like I want to grab her ass, so I'm just gonna do it. Like there's a sort of lack of witness consciousness there.
Mm.
So a mind-body integration supports, that is a mind-body that's both connected and differentiated. In my mind, is the quality of beingness that supports more of integrated sexuality that is neither denying or victim to like these body impulses or emotional responses where things get dysregulated or things become rigid in our life. That doesn't make any sense. I know
that makes sense.
Concepts
and yeah, it's funny you mentioned their symphony metaphor because I use that often myself in a different context where I often say that it's not about balance, it's about harmony because and I use the symphony metaphor where in a symphony, if everything was equal, that would sound horrible. And that is why it's not equal. Some instruments are played loudly and some are played softly and some are not played at all sometimes. But there is a harmony between all of the instruments being played.
Yeah. Yeah. And then so when we can start with our mind body being more in harmony with each other, that sets a template from being more in harmony with self and other.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think when you have both the differentiation and the integration, I think you also have a sense that this person in front of you is a different person from you. And at the same time, you have enough connection to know if I, just grab her ass without her permission, then she would feel hurt, and you would feel that even before you touch her, right? Without the moral rules, like.
Right. Yeah. So it's not, we're not dependent on some external arbitrary authority setting these standards that tend to that aren't grounded in the here and now according to who's present and what their needs and values and desires and connections are. Right. But it's like when we drop more into acknowledging the intelligence of the body and its sensations and our emotions, then we're more attuned to the present moment and who we're with. And then so there's a natural ebb and flow and harmony that's just far more graceful and elegant and beautiful and alive and juicy and connected than any moral rigidity could possibly give us. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've experienced that. And like when I go to workshops like contact improv and conscious movement, especially when we do the mirroring exercise where we play, each person takes turns playing a follower and a leader, and we mirror exactly what the other person's doing. We mirror their movements. And in the third phase, we give up who's leader or follower, and we just do it spontaneously. And especially when we go into that third phase, there's this sense of like, it's just magical where we don't even have to consciously worry about things like consent and all of that. Like it's always consensual every moment. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a certain amount of valuing of you paying attention to self and other, paying attention to your body, honoring like these impulses that are arising. And then so that all contributes to the magic of the connection and harmony that you're experiencing together.
Yeah. And speaking of empathy, just yesterday actually, I had a session with a friend of mine who's also a sexuality and relationship coach. In fact, I interviewed her on one of these episodes. And I had a session because I started noticing something unusual happening to me. I was noticing when I was around women this week, I had this heightened sense of both fear and lust that I had not experienced before. I was like, that's really strange. So I had a session with her, and she was like, she tuned in, and we were like, oh, you're actually experiencing their emotions, not even yours, because women walk around all the time with this sense of, I want a man, but I'm scared. I want a man, but I'm scared. And you were feeling that. I was like, whoa. And I was able to really like disengage and get back into myself. So So that's the other thing about empathy is there's differentiation, right? Knowing whose emotions are whose. With your own clients, like how do you help them with that?
Hmm. It starts with a certain amount of self-awareness.
Hmm.
Right? That like even knowing what you're feeling in the first place is a learning curve
Mm-hmm.
for some of
Yeah.
I know for myself, I I grew up in I had a childhood that my kind of my survival strategy included leaving my body. So it's my
Mm.
adult life has been a long process of coming deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And yeah, so to even know what I'm feeling has taken a certain amount of time.
Mm.
And then so once I start to get familiar with my own emotions, or once I help my clients feel safe enough to start landing more and more into their bodies and paying more and more attention to their emotions and sensations and natural impulse, they'll start like noticing like what is their norm or their default or their familiar patterns, especially when we're dealing with trauma. It's really helpful to go like, oh, I consistently have this fear that I'm going to be rejected, no matter who I'm with. Right? So if it's consistent fear that I'm going to be rejected by no matter who I'm with, chances are that's mine. Right?
Mm.
Um, so the more we can start like feeling into what's the past and in the present, and start kind of creating some differentiation between those pieces and acknowledging what our natural defaults are and start getting more and more familiar with our MO. Then when you start coming into contact with other people, you'll kind of notice like, oh, the tide rises or falls, or like this emotion starts really bubbling up to the surface, or this one doesn't feel so safe to explore. And then so you can start noticing the impact of what shifts in your own container once you're in contact with other people. And then if you find yourself consistently having a rise in anger in response to this particular person, then you can start getting curious of like, is it just this? Is my experience of anger that consistently shows up in my relationship with this person, but doesn't seem to show up much with other people? Maybe it has something to do with what they're holding. And I'm a fan of just like moving through life with continuous curiosity and creating hypotheses and just kind of like doing little experiments to evaluate the validity of a hypothesis. And then it's like the more and more our hypothesis has a certain level of coherence, then the more and more likely it's true. But first, in terms of developing empathy, it's like you need to start getting more connected to your own instrument and recognize the inherent distortions in the lens that we carry. Attend to that, differentiate between my lens and what's real in the present moment with this person, and then start noticing the impact of that person's experience on your experience. And then, yeah, it starts to develop. I will also say about empathy, if we've got a particular taboo around certain emotions, like I'm not allowed to feel anger, I'm not allowed to feel sadness, I'm not allowed to feel fill in the blank, then if we can't allow our instrument to vibrate in those frequencies, or if those frequencies are constantly stuck on off or constantly stuck on off, like those particular emotions, then our capacity for empathy is going to be diminished. If we can't vibrate with sadness, if we don't let ourselves feel sad, or we can't recognize when sadness isn't present because we're constantly feeling sad.
Yeah, yeah. Especially anger, it's so like demonized in the spiritual community, which is why I came up with my model of like the 4 types of anger to
Yeah,
really differentiate and let people know not all anger is bad. Like out of the 4, like only
right,
1 can be technically called bad, and then even that is useful.
right. In some
Yeah,
contexts, in some
yeah,
occasions.
yeah, 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 exactly. So we have a comment here. Let's see. Christina Marie Depa said, "What is the intention so all can be loved together in all ways? Always." I don't know if that's a rhetorical question or an actual question, but
The big question that happened an hour ago.
yeah, 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 it is, the intention is, I think the intention is for us to be whole, not just to be loved. It's like, like you mentioned, like anger, sadness, fear, lust, guilt, shame, and to allow the wholeness of all of us and even the parts of ourselves that actually don't feel loving at times. But if we can embrace it all, we experience a sense of freedom, and from that, we can get back to love.
Yeah, I resonate with
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Um,
So what's like an example from your own life when you experience like when you shifted from morality into sexual integrity, sexual integration, the way you speak of it, how did it like benefit or transform your own life and your own sexual relationships?
Excuse me while I pause and feel into that question.
Hmm.
Um, so what's coming up for me now is the awareness that it's this from morality to integration is not a straight line.
Hmm.
Um, but I feel like I'm moving more on like this process or kind of like a spiraling process. It's not like I've like liberated myself from any moral conditioning and I'm living a totally integrated life and I am now officially enlightened and certified or of any nature, right? It's like it's like I'm find myself kind of like encountering within my own psyche moral programming and the shame that comes with it. And then I apply this practice to shift my current state to some degree towards more and more integration, more and more of this state of harmony within myself. Um, so I come from Catholic, I'm Filipina. So
Hmm.
Catholicism is predominant in my culture, in my heritage. My mom, if you ask her friends, her college friends, they'll say she grew up in a nunnery. So my dad was her only sexual partner in her entire life.
Oh.
Um, and so that says something a little bit about the cultural moral frame from which I was conceived in. Right? I am totally Californian. Bay Area, California, like on an adult consciousness level. Like I swim in polyamorous communities and I'm a sex and relationship coach. There's a lot of sex positivity in my culture, in my current culture. So I find myself kind of navigating between these two realities where I'm practicing honoring my sexual truth and also bumping up against these moral challenges of uh, just like sex is my pleasure is not a good thing.
Hmm.
My value and my experience of love is from my childhood is coupled to this experience of submitting to a larger like another authority. So my process of integration has included a lot of coming back to my body and listening for the truth of what I genuinely feel pleasurable. And honoring that. And that I feel like my arc of integration, a big thread in that has included learning how to be empowered in my yeses and nos. Like as a teenager, I was really promiscuous and I was seeking a lot of validation through others, through sexuality, and wasn't really connected to my body around what my authentic yes and nos were in relationship. So I would have sex and then I would feel incredibly guilty and shameful around it. As I've gotten more and more into my body, I've been able to get more and more refined around what I authentically want in my sexual experience. I've gotten better and better at articulating and advocating for what I want. Less more pressure, less no no to that amount of stimulation. Yes, I want to get this close. No, I don't want to get that close. Like this process of standing in my body and being an advocate for what authentically turns me on and what authentically turns me off has been a total learning curve. And I am not done in that learning curve, but I'm a hell of a lot better than I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, where I was abandoning myself and I was allowing myself to be used. And now that I'm more integrated in my body consciousness, there's less and less instances of me crossing my own boundaries and not advocating for my truth. I'm putting myself into situations and creating connections with people that doesn't feel like a yes to this body, what it needs now, what my heart needs now. I know I was a little foggy and a little all over the place and not super linear in that response to that answer. I am aware that in this past week, I've been encountering another layer of trauma from my childhood, from like 7 to 14, and I know there's a certain amount of freeze associated with that, like a certain level of disassociation and freeze associated with that. So that feels like a little coupled into my mental mapping and communication right now. So I apologize for a little bit of the linear depiction of what I was.
I understand. That's fine. Yeah. And I noticed on your slide, you're coach mostly for men, right? At this point.
Currently, my practice is predominantly with men. I originally started off with being more with women. And lately I've been noticing more women coming into my practice. So it's not exclusive with men. One of the unique things about my practice is that I do consciously work with the erotic charge that shows up in the room. It's not a taboo thing. It's something we
So your sessions are in person?
Say that again?
Your sessions are in person? And not on the phone, but like in person live?
Oh, and mostly work in person. I do work to a certain extent over Skype or
So you were saying, sorry to interrupt, you were saying that you allow for the erotic charge in the room and nothing's taboo when you work?
I don't cross my own boundaries. It's one of my pieces that I attend to. I don't think it's a good idea to model in intimacy a woman crossing her own boundaries in order to meet.
Yeah.
yeah, it's so much of learning of how to be in intimate and sexual relationships, erotic relationships in my practice is a real time and experience. So we're not talking about just talking about sex or eroticism happening over there outside the room in some future tense or past tense. It's like it's happening here now. And if we focus on the present moment around this erotic experience and experience happening here now with mindfulness and curiosity and safety, then there's an opportunity to attend to those subtle pieces that just kind of get swept underneath the rug when you're on a real date, right? Like the fears that might bubble up or the habitual patterns that might show up around like maybe a little strategizing or the even subtle patterns of like oh, I'm just going to please her and focus more on meeting her expectations rather than practicing actually staying in one's body and staying connected to their own erotic desires and wants and staying contained. So it's it's an opportunity for real time embodied learning experiences in a safe laboratory. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So, what is your number one like piece of advice for men, or like transformational practice or connection practice, especially around like things like consent? Especially since there's all this Me Too thing happening as well, and women are actually becoming more empowered and free these days, which is a good thing. So, what would you like to say to the men?
Um, right now, I'm aware of how many of my clients, it feels like the primary work that we do, at least for men, is integrating heart and balls.
Mm.
So in spiritual communities, there can be this elevation of heart and, and the suppression of balls.
Mm-hmm.
There can be in kind of like mainstream culture, there can be a devaluing of heart and an overemphasis on ballsy behavior, which leads to
Mm-hmm.
sort of experiences, right?
Yeah.
Or if you're in this kind of like wanting to overvalue the heart and devalue potency of the beauty of cocks and balls, then one can easily get stuck in the friend zone and not really develop the level of sexual intimacy or emotional intimacy that one really longs for. And then so, yeah, just like developing more and more of a disciplined practice, a devoted practice to paying attention to what's happening in your heart and in your pelvis. And developing, like almost feeding a line, a channel of energy between your heart and balls. Like if you can circulate energy between one's heart and one's cock, balls, just like really own and inhabit both areas of one's body and one's consciousness, then yeah, it's a setup for, it sets a foundation for more fulfilling, intimate experiences.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you. And what would you like to say for women?
Hmm. Um, the word erotic sovereignty is coming to mind. This phrase
Mm,
has come to mind lately. Is, it's a practice of taking full responsibility for one's sexual well being, which includes our emotional well being. But yeah, if there's more and more attending to our pleasure, to our boundaries, to our empowered truth and honoring of oneself, then and being willing to like set boundaries out of self-love and a devotion to embodied presence, then things start shifting in beautiful ways in all of our relationships.
mm.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. So yeah, thank you everyone for watching this, especially Amy and Christina. Thanks for the comments and the likes and the hearts. We're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Lorena, for being here.
Thank you for
Yeah.
inviting.
So yeah, so one final question, and I've been trying to do this more often. So with every show, it's really inspired by Gary Vaynerchuk. He does this too all the time with his show. And so right now I have about 5,000 friends and followers on this Facebook page, and then there's my groups and pages as well. So you have an opportunity to crowdsource wisdom. So what is a question you would like to ask the audience?
Hmm. How do you nurture your erotic aliveness?
Hmm. How do you nurture your erotic aliveness? That's a great question. Yeah. And is there any question that you wish I'd asked you?
Um, Something's coming to mind. I'm feeling
Good.
pretty
So you
complete.
feel complete?
Yeah, grateful.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And your website's lorinamanzanita.com, right?
Mhm.
Excellent. And
Opportunity.
if somebody wants to work with you, how would they do that? Is it like a discovery call or?
Exactly. Check out my website to find ways to contact me. I offer a free or complimentary 30-minute phone or Skype or Zoom, as the case may be lately, um, discovery call. So just a safe space for us to tune in to what's desired, needed, make sure we're in right alignment, working together.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Lorena.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Mm, yeah. Have a great day. Bye.